All right, thank you all for joining this critical webinar. And I'm going to actually pass it to Lily, who's going to get us kicked off. And we'll start off with some introductions and get into the content.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Lily. I am an attorney at the Mississippi Center for Justice, and I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Kim Wiley, who will introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kim Wiley. I am the Director of the Education Equity Campaign here at the Mississippi Center for Justice, and I am excited to be here this afternoon. And I'll kick it off to Max.
Hello, everyone. I am Max Altman. I'm the Director of Research and Policy at the Southern Education Foundation, and I'm on the Technical Assistance team for the Equity Assistance Center South. Really glad to be here, and I will hand it off to Tabitha.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tabitha Reynolds-Hong. I'm a Research and Policy Analyst here at SCF and a Technical Assistance Team member for the EXL. And I'll pass it back to Tahita.
Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Tahita Abdullah. I currently serve as the Technical Assistance Lead for the Equity Assistance Center South, which is housed under the Southern Education Foundation. So a little bit about the EAC South. We are a technical assistance center that advises, assists, and serves public schools and districts in their work to provide equal opportunities for students in the areas of race, national origin, sex, and religion as required by federal law. So we offer a range of services that include universal, targeted, and intensive supports. One universal resource we offer is webinars, which we're so happy that you were able to attend today. We're really excited to kick off this webinar in partnership with the Mississippi Center for Justice, knowing that they can offer strong and practical guidance on IDEA and Section 504 support and address those barriers and strengthening supports to ensure that all students, especially those with disabilities, are positioned to reach their full potential. With that said, I'll pass it back to Lily.
All right, thank you so much. We are so excited to partner with the EAC South and are grateful for the opportunity to present to y'all. This format is a little bit new for me, so I am used to presenting to live audiences, and if there is anything that comes up during the presentation, feel free to drop it in the chat. We also have the Q&A function, and we'll get to that when we get to the end of the presentation, but we are covering a lot of ground. So if at any point I'm going too fast or you have a clarifying question, please put it in the chat and we can address it at that point. So y'all can see on the screen, we have our training objectives and overview. We're going to do a quick introduction of what special education is, some key terms, because it is the land of the acronyms. We are all about acronyms in special education. We're going to talk about the district's child find obligation and what your role as an educator looks like there, planning for accommodations, how to incorporate those into your lesson plans, goals and progress reports, and then we can wrap up with a discussion and Q&A. So if anyone has any questions about that, we can roll through. So special education, this is just a quick definition of what special education is. It is specially designed instruction that is designed to meet the unique needs of eligible kids whose educational needs cannot be met through the regular instruction program. So that can look like pull-out services, special day classes, various different, instructional tools that can be used, and it's administered through an individualized education program, also known as an IEP, which I'm sure many of you have heard about before. It's important to note, this is sort of a common point of confusion. Section 504 is the law under which children with 504 plans are served. That is not special education, that is purely accommodations. And we'll get into the difference between special education and 504 plans in just a couple of slides. So this slide is giving you all a quick overview of what some related services might look like. That can look like physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech language services, a whole range of different related service providers. In addition to that specially designed instruction, these services are going to be identified through an evaluation, and that whole process will show what each student really needs to access their education. So if you have a student who's being pulled out for any of these services, that is because it's in their IEP. And then here we have a slide that is going over the difference between IEPs and 504 plans. I will let y'all just take a second to read over it. I don't want to, read every single word on it, but it shows that there are different laws that are governing each plan. And there are fewer categories of disability that can be served under an IEP than a 504 plan. So for example, under the IEP, there are only 13 categories of disability that would make a student eligible. Under the 504 plan, that broader definition of disability might encompass more medical conditions. So if a student comes in and, they have, let's say, a diagnosis of diabetes, that's not one of the eligible categories under the IDEA, but they might need certain accommodations like bathroom breaks, additional water, time to take their insulin, that would require a 504 plan. Any questions so far about the difference between those? Okay, seeing none, we will get to some key terms. So like I said, special education, a lot of acronyms. That first acronym there is the IDEA. That is the federal law that governs basically the entire special education universe. It is a long law, but and confusing at times. And our goal today is to sort of break down the key provisions that are most applicable to you as educators and district staff. That second term, free appropriate public education, that is the guarantee to students with disabilities under the law. They are guaranteed a free appropriate public education, the keyword there being appropriate, and that goes back to that evaluation. Those services will determine what looks appropriate for each student. It is a very individualized process. And free just means that all those services must be provided free of charge to that student. Least restrictive environment, that's another key tenet of that law. That is basically the guarantee that a child with a disability is going to be educated in their least restrictive environment, or the environment where they have the most access to their non-disabled peers. So one of the driving forces behind the IDEA was the tendency of public schools to segregate disabled children into separate facilities, separate classrooms, where they didn't really have a lot of interaction with their non-disabled peers. And the goal of this law was to remediate that and, really encourage more inclusive classrooms, more inclusive experiences for students with disabilities. And so that is that determination that's made by the IEP committee on, based on the student's services, based on what they need, how can we maximize their time spent in the general education classroom? I already touched on this, the IEP, that is that document that basically outlines their entire educational program. So that's going to have all of their goals in it. It's going to have where they are right now in terms of their present levels of performance. It's going to have all of their special education and related services, and it's going to have their placement, which is where are they being educated. Functional behavioral assessment, FBA, behavior intervention plan, the BIP. That is for children who have behavioral challenges, or anything, if their disability manifests in behavioral issues. A lot of times there will be a behavioral assessment conducted and then a plan that is put in place based on that assessment. Manifestation determination review. If you are an administrator or a teacher and there's been a disciplinary incident that involves a child with a disability where they are facing 10 days or more of suspension or potentially expulsion, that is that meeting you have before the formal disciplinary hearing, where you get together and you review all the documentation and say, was this conduct a manifestation of the child's disability? If yes, then the child cannot be disciplined. Assistive technology, that is any sort of technology that assists in, communication or access to curriculum. Accommodation, that is, something that's put in place to help the child access the curriculum, whereas modification is actually changing the curriculum. Related services, we touched on that in the previous slide. Especially design instruction, that's going to be your special education. And then transition is actually going from, it's the planning that takes place when a child turns 16 or younger. In some states, in Mississippi it's 14, for what that post-secondary or after high school transition is going to look like. And then for our teacher participation in the IEP process, this is where it's really important to remember that you are a key member of the IEP team. I remember going to IEP meetings when I was a teacher and just feeling sort of lost. You know, I wasn't given the documentation beforehand. I wasn't really sure sometimes why we were meeting. And so, but your voice is really important because you're the one who sees the student the most. And so before the meeting, it's important to be reviewing that student's current IEP, have their documents handy with you in the meeting. If you don't have a copy, that's a really good, it would be a really good time to request that from the special education teacher to be able to familiarize yourself with the student's accommodations, their goals, and the services. Bring any sort of classroom data. If you have grades or work samples or any other progress reports that you use to track students' progress in your classroom, that's a really important piece of feedback that the team needs to see during that meeting. Reflect before you go into that meeting on the student's strengths and needs. Be prepared to share what you're seeing in the classroom in terms of where they're really excelling and also where they might need a little bit more help, because that might inform the supports and services that are put in place at that meeting. Any questions about what to do before an IEP meeting? Okay, great. So during the meeting, it's going to be a group of people, including probably an administrator, definitely the parent, sometimes the student. If that student is there, they're required to be invited once they reach the transition age. So that's either 16 or younger, to talk about what their post-transition goals look like. Sometimes a student is really, you know, outspoken and wants to advocate on behalf of themselves, and so they're welcome to join the meeting. And at that point, you know, it's always good to, you know, rather than talk at the child, talk with the child if they are in that meeting. So even if they aren't, great to use student-centered language, focus on their abilities, needs, and progress, rather than just, you know, talking about their challenges in the classroom. And always try to be specific and objective. So, you know, that's where that bringing the data into the meeting comes in. So having, you know, actual numbers and progress reports and data to say, this is an area of deficit, this is where they're excelling, rather than just general feelings and observations. And then also share what's working. What strategies have you been using? Maybe it's something that the team hadn't thought of that you do in your classroom, that they can add to the IEP. And it's always important, you know, some of these meetings can get tense. When I'm brought into a meeting as an attorney, a lot of times that has, you know, escalated to a point where the school and the parent are not quite getting along. And so I'm in the room, and I can see how that tension can a lot of times be a barrier to being collaborative. But, you know, I think it's important for all parties at the table to stay positive and collaborative, and that can really make the process go a lot more smoothly. And being mindful of jargon, always important. We just went over a bunch of acronyms. And so, you know, making sure that you as a teacher and a professional are speaking in a way that's accessible to parents and students. And also, you know, asking questions. It's probably on everyone's mind if you have a question about an IEP, if something isn't clear. It would be really helpful for you to ask that clarifying question in case someone was too afraid to speak up and ask that question. And then after the meeting, so the work doesn't end after the meeting. You're going to want to review that finalized IEP. So a lot of times in the IEP, there will be changes that are made. And so if there have been adjustments to services or adjustments to accommodations, reviewing that finalized IEP to make sure that you understand what is expected of you in terms of implementing accommodations in the classroom is really important. Collaborate with colleagues. So special education teacher, inclusion teacher, case manager of that student is going to be key to ensuring that you're implementing those supports and tracking data in a way that, that is going to be helpful to the child and to the IEP team. Monitor progress, and we'll get into this a little bit later about what that looks like. And then follow up with parents. A quick call or text, that always goes a really long way, especially after an IEP meeting, just to know that y'all have that open line of communication. So before we move on to Child Find, just wanted to check the chat to make sure there are no questions. Okay, great. So Child Find, this is an obligation that is in the IDEA for every school district to find and locate and then evaluate children with disabilities. So a lot of times this happens way before they reach the elementary school. There's a whole part of IDEA that focuses on 0 to 3. But sometimes kids slip through the cracks and they don't get identified before they get to the K through 12 setting. And so educators who are with children every day should be looking for key signs that a child may need to be evaluated for special education services. And that can include behavioral challenges, poor academic performance, or withdrawal from social interaction. Oh, there's a question in the Q&A. I apologize. Let me make sure. Okay. Q&A. Do I have information or resources for adults 23 plus in the workplace? Oh, that's a great question. So the IDEA extends until a child is 21. So unfortunately, after that point, there are no more legal protections under the IDEA, but I do know that there are certain workplaces that specifically hire students with disabilities, and a lot of the transition planning that happens at the high school level should be taking into account goals and putting in place, connections to resources and other agencies that can assist that student beyond graduation and hopefully in the 23 plus years. But I am not clear on what specific resources there are for that population. I'm sorry. Thank you for that question. So looking at what Child Find looks like in practice for a district. A lot of times a district will have a Child Find coordinator as well as a school level Child Find contact. So those will usually be 2 separate people depending on the size of your district. It might just be one if you're in a really small rural district. If you do suspect that one of your students has a disability, I would start by finding out who your building level contact is, and then contacting them in writing. I know as teachers and staff, it can get really busy, and a quick sort of note in the hallway when you're just passing by, that might not stick with someone. So just having it in writing to make sure that it can be revisited and is actually seen and responded to is really huge. And when you are making that referral, make sure you explain why you think the child might have a disability. What are you seeing in your classroom? Bring in some data, observations, other information. And then also, what interventions have you used so far that have been effective, that have not worked? Just sort of thinking about how have you worked with that child and what have you seen? And I included, this is the Mississippi Department of Education. It's for their multi-tiered system of supports model. But any sort of form like this can be really helpful in terms of just tracking what's going on. So, there's no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to getting some data on your students. Just talking about, if you're trying redirection, talk about, what situations you might be using that in with the student, what's going on before the situations arise, how well does the student respond to that intervention? And all of that data is going to be really, really helpful to the Child Find coordinator in assessing, what the next steps are for that referral. And then here are just a few other things to look out for in your classroom. If there are really persistent difficulties in key areas like reading, writing, math, communication is a big one. Not making adequate progress even when you're using those interventions. Poor performance on tests, assignments, or in understanding and following instructions. So, if you have a child who you can see is paying attention, but is always asking for you to repeat an instruction, or is turning to their classmates saying, what was just said, there might be a receptive language barrier there. There also might be, some hearing problems. So just looking out for anything that that doesn't quite seem explainable by other factors. And then also the gap between a student's potential and their actual academic achievement. There might be something else going on there. Another thing to look at is behavior. So it's not just academics that can be addressed by an IEP. It can also be behavioral challenges. So looking at frequent behavioral issues like tantrums, any sort of oppositional defiance, difficulty staying focused, controlling impulses, regulating emotions, looking at sort of is the child withdrawing from social situations? Are they, you know, being avoidant when it comes to tasks or social activities? So just, you know, paying attention and looking at those patterns across different settings, but especially in your classroom. And then social emotional challenges. So this is kind of related to behavioral, but looking more at those interpersonal relationships between peers. Are they having issues making friends? Are they showing, you know, anxiety, especially around high pressure assignments like tests or depression? Are they sleeping a lot in class and you know that they're getting a full night of sleep at home? Do you see really high highs and low lows that are affecting your students' school performance? So you know, just looking at how they're managing their emotions and how they're responding to, you know, big shifts in routine can be an important thing to look out for. And then I mentioned this earlier, but communication difficulties. So if a child is having, you know, delays in their language, having trouble producing sounds, forming sentences, understanding and following directions, those could all be signs that they might need speech language therapy. They might need an assistive communication device. So, you know, thinking about how that's impacting their academics and how they show up in the classroom is going to be huge. Developmental delays in reaching age appropriate milestones. You know, we're not all doctors who know the exact days and years that a child is supposed to reach a milestone, but if something is clearly, you know, if other kids in your class are clearly meeting a milestone and one or two are not, then that might be something to flag in the child find area. So we have a quick scenario, and I'm not sure how this is going to work with the chat, but feel free, I'm going to read it out loud to y'all, and then feel free to drop answers to the questions in the chat. But so here is the scenario. I told you I'm more used to an interactive format, so bear with me. Here is a child find scenario for Jordan. Miss Rivera is a second grade teacher. One of her students, Jordan, has been struggling throughout the school year. Academically, he is significantly behind grade level in reading, often guessing words instead of sounding them out. He has difficulty completing written assignments and frequently leaves work unfinished. Behaviorally, he becomes restless during independent work time, often wandering around the room or distracting peers. Sometimes refuses to attempt tasks that seem difficult and has begun to complain of stomach aches to avoid reading activities. Ms. Rivera has tried several Tier 1 strategies, including small group reading instruction, frequent breaks, and positive reinforcement. She's also communicated with Jordan's family, who report that homework takes hours and often ends in tears. Despite these supports, Jordan shows little progress. At a recent meeting, Ms. Rivera raised concerns with her colleagues. Some suggested that it's just a motivation issue and that Jordan will catch up eventually, and others encouraged her to consider whether Jordan may need additional evaluation and support. So based on what we just talked about with the child find obligations, what should Ms. Rivera and the school team do next? See if anyone is brave in the chat. I think you can respond anonymously, or maybe that's just for Q&A. I'm not sure. Request an IEP. Thanks, Rick. Yeah. So definitely flag that the student needs additional services. We're going to get into this a little bit. Yep, Dawn says fill out child find. That's great. Yeah, so at this point, we're reaching out to our building level child find contact, whoever that may be. If you don't know, I would ask the principal, and making that referral in writing. So basically everything that Ms. Rivera has seen, write that down in an email to that child find contact. And after that, the process is sort of out of your hands until, and we'll get to that in a second. And this is a trick question because I actually, oh yes, I see Ms. Carter said possibly talking with the counselor. Yep. And the counselor might actually be the child find contact. So if the counselor is aware of this, then that's definitely a support that can be put in place as well. And here's a bit of a trick question, but it's something that I've seen a lot at the school level. It's a trick question because I talk about it with you guys, but do you know how the team should balance providing general education support, so that RTI multi-tiered support system, with the obligation to evaluate for special education services, so child find versus MTSS? And that's okay, because I didn't talk about it. But there is some guidance from the Department of Education that says that using the tier system or tiered interventions, that cannot delay an evaluation for special education. So it's great that that child is receiving tiered supports, but they don't actually have to move through all of the tiers of support before getting to an evaluation. There should be an evaluation at any point that there is a suspected disability at play. Oh, thanks, Tahita. I will take you up on that. Referral. So after the district receives your referral, that triggers what's called the multidisciplinary evaluation team, or the MET team. So that is required to convene within 14 days of receiving your referral. So this is a quick process. And you might be on this team. It's basically a team of school staff that review grades, discipline reports, attendance reports, tier forms if there are any, classroom observation, etc. So once the MET team reviews that information, then they make a determination of whether the child is eligible. So just because you make a referral doesn't mean that child is automatically going to get the IEP. It just means that they will be referred to this team that then does a holistic review of all of their documentation, and then determines if that child is eligible. If they are determined eligible, and this is key, the parent must consent to an evaluation. So the school cannot evaluate a child without parental consent. And that can, a lot of times as an educator, require some communication with the parent, especially if the parent is resistant to the idea of their child having a disability, sort of, framing it as a positive that their child is going to get supports, and, making sure that everyone is on the same page. So we have another scenario for Michael.
All right. Mr. Jones, a third grade teacher, is concerned about Michael's progress in reading. During his lunch break, Mr. Jones discusses his concerns with the school psychologist, Ms. Kearns. Based on Mr. Jones's description, Ms. Kearns believes that Michael probably has a learning disability. Ms. Kearns has an opening in her schedule for the next day, so she suggests to Mr. Jones that she can come tomorrow to test Michael to see if he qualifies for special education.
So what is wrong with this scenario, if anything? Or did everyone do everything right? Yes, Ms. Randall said parents were not notified. That is the ticket. What other step was, yep, no team meeting. All right, we're on it. Thanks, guys. Yeah, so there should have been a referral and then the MET team meeting. And then the parents need to give informed consent to start that evaluation process. Here are just a few important considerations, and then we're going to wrap up our discussion on child find. So if y'all have any questions on that, just feel free to drop them in the chat. But yes, great job, Ms. Randall. So thinking through, making that referral, a student's struggles can be due to a lot of different factors, including, what's going on at home, lack of appropriate instruction. If they didn't have a certified teacher in the grade before, they might have some skill gaps there that are not because of a disability, but just because of instructional gaps. Or language barriers. If you have an English language learner, it might be because of that. So it's important before you make that referral to rule out those as primary causes. But as we just discussed, just because you make a referral does not mean that a student is going to be a special education student. It just means that the information will be reviewed. And that's sort of the point of the MET team, is to actually determine, based on the data, based on all the information, is this an eligible child? And of course, ongoing communication with parents and obtaining their consent is crucial. All right, now we are going to talk a little bit about planning for accommodations. So if you have a child with an IEP in your room, you will get an accommodation sheet. And sometimes it will list modifications as well and interventions. So just a quick overview of what the differences are between all of those things. Accommodations, the expectations, requirements, and the content of the work remains the same, but it's just the format or delivery that's being adapted. So, you know, an accommodation might be extra time if a child needs extra time, but the worksheet that they're doing actually is the same. A modification, on the other hand, the expectations, requirements, or content is adjusted. So if a child is reading significantly below grade level, providing materials that are on their reading level rather than grade level. And then interventions, those are temporary and targeted things that are just aimed at bridging a specific knowledge gap. So that might involve adding additional instruction or progress monitoring to make sure that those interventions are actually being effective. Any questions about the differences between those two terms before we move on? Okay. We have created a bit of a toolkit for y'all, hoping that it will make planning and you know, incorporating these accommodations and modifications into instruction a little bit easier, because it can be overwhelming. And it goes back to universal design for learning principles, which I'm sure y'all have been exposed to throughout your training as educators, but a lot of it comes down to multiple means of engagement. So providing students with choices, setting clear goals, connecting learning to student interests. That's something that is already being done in the classroom and that benefits gen ed students as well as your special education students. Multiple means of representation. So that could be visual, audio, hands-on activities. Again, something that is really helpful for all students in the classroom, regardless of disability. And then multiple means of action or expression. So that's letting students show what they know in different ways, whether that's writing things down, speaking, just multiple modes of demonstration. And here is sort of a step-by-step. So the first step of planning for accommodations in your classroom is reading carefully. So reviewing the student's IEP. Oh, sorry, I did not. There we go. Reading carefully, reviewing the student's IEP or their 504 plan at the start of the year. So you should be getting, when I was teaching, it was a folder with all of my students' IEP accommodation sheets, highlighting those key supports. So note acquired accommodations for specific students, modifications, and their services. And if anything is unclear, make sure you ask questions of the special education teacher. Check with their case manager, their counselor, making sure that you're sort of on the same page of what's expected. The second, implement accommodations consistently. So important to note that accommodations, when they're in the IEP document, that's a legally binding document, they are not optional. They have been determined by the IEP team to be necessary for that student to access the general education curriculum to the maximum extent required. So examples might be extended time, preferential seating, frequent breaks, or access to notes. And some students might not need all of their accommodations all the time, but it's important to at least offer them. So if a student gets extended time on a test and they don't take the whole time, it's still important to say, you know, like, you have this amount of time, you can use all of it if you need to. And then the third is making appropriate modifications if that's what that child's IEP requires. So adjusting assignments when required. Reminder that modifications change the what. So that might look like fewer problems, a simplified reading level, while accommodations change the how. And it's, you know, important to collaborate with the special education teacher to ensure that you're maintaining the rigor of the assignment, but also that it's aligned with the student's IEP. And yeah, collaborate. Step number 4 is creating an inclusive classroom environment. So normalize supports, present accommodations as common practice. So that goes back to that universal design of learning slide. If a student gets, you know, multiple modes of presentation, that might just be something to incorporate in your whole classroom so that the student doesn't feel singled out and everyone can benefit. And then promote peer understanding. So encourage a classroom culture that values diverse learning styles, maybe incorporate some disability-specific learning modules around Disability Awareness Month. And then step 5, communicate and collaborate, stay connected. So checking in regularly with special educators, counselors, parents, other service providers, providing feedback, that's sharing data on how the supports and the interventions in your classroom are actually helping the student or not helping the student. Both of those are really important. Seeking solutions as a team. So if a challenge arises, problem solving collaboratively. You don't have to go it alone. The whole point of an IEP team is that the student has a sort of support group that is rallying behind them, knows what's going on with them, and can also provide support for everyone on the team. And that last step, documenting and reflect. So tracking how those accommodations are being implemented in your classroom, and we'll get to sort of what that looks like in a bit. Note student progress, note student regression. Again, both are really important sources of data. Be proactive, address concerns early so that the IEP team can adjust supports if needed. So don't just wait until the end of the first semester when that student is, you know, failing beyond repair. Make sure that you're going to the special education teacher if something is coming up and you're noticing a downward trend, to make sure that things are put in place to avoid further failure. And then here we have planning for accommodations toolkit. So this is basically just a quick lesson planning checklist that might be helpful to have on hand when you're planning your lessons. Just say, you know, have I reviewed which students need those accommodations? Just a quick, you know, go down the line, make sure you're cognizant of which students have accommodations. Did I build multiple ways for students to access content? Visual, auditory, hands-on? Are assignments and assessments adaptable to different needs? Do I have a plan for flexible grouping? So am I putting different students in different groups so that they can have different peer support? And have I checked with the special education teacher about alignment with 504 and IEP plans? And this right here is just a quick little lesson plan add-on for those students with disabilities, just to have it all in one place and to know, you know, this is the student, this is their IEP or 504 supports, and really coming up with a plan on the front end of how you're going to provide those supports so that it flows more naturally within the progression of your lesson. And then also knowing ahead of time what evidence and data you'll be needing to collect to monitor progress is going to be helpful. And just the more you plan in advance, the less actual work it's going to take. And I see we have a Q&A. Will this recording be sent to participants? Yes, Mr. Murphy, it will be. It should be available if you registered. It should be sending to you, and then you can email us if you have folks who need the recording. And here are just some common strategies. This looks like a lot, but I promise it's not. Some examples of accommodations that you might see on an IEP can be in the instruction category, assessment. So that's, you know, when a student is getting tested, what sort of accommodations do they have in that setting? The environment, assignments, organization, communication. These are just examples in that second column of things you might see. And then these are corresponding strategies. So if you're looking at that lesson planning template, thinking about how you're going to accommodate visual aids, for example, if that student gets visual aids as an accommodation, then you could think about using slides and graphic organizers and incorporating those into the lesson plan. And that would be a really great way to accommodate that student and probably also help your other students who don't have an IEP but are visual learners. So I'll leave this up for a minute or two. Grab some water, see if anyone has questions. And EAC folks, I don't know if I'm making a promise that I can't keep, but I'd be happy to share this slide deck with anyone if they would like a copy after the presentation.
Yep, absolutely. We can do that.
Okay, awesome. And so this is just a quick, a blank toolkit, thinking about the date of what the lesson is going to be, the accommodation provided, what the lesson or activity was, and whether it was effective. This is just a really important, it doesn't have to be in this format, but it's really important to note, how you were providing those accommodations and whether it was actually effective. Because when you have that next IEP meeting, it will be something that you can present that's going to be really helpful to the team in assessing, whether we're going to keep an accommodation on the IEP or not. Okay. Yes, Cameron, absolutely. Right. And then collaboration tips. So I think you've probably heard me say it about 12 times already, but collaboration is so important to supporting students with IEPs. Checking in regularly with special education staff, proactively, so not always waiting until a problem arises. Using shared documents or logs to track how accommodations are implemented can also reduce some of the burden on you as a classroom teacher. Communicating with families about how those supports look in your classroom. So a lot of parents will go to an IEP meeting and are presented with this, really overwhelming 40-page document. And sometimes it's really quick, they got to get back to work, so they'll sign, and it's not really clear in that moment how it's going to look for their student in the classroom. So just being really transparent of saying, this is how so-and-so learns, and this is what I'm doing to support them can go a really long way in terms of establishing that parent-teacher trust. And then also, grade and age appropriate, but inviting student feedback. So what actually students are the experts on their own experience. What do they feel like helps them the most? If you have a student who has extended time on their IEP and they are always finishing assignments before other kids, maybe they don't need that. And that's something that they can communicate to you, and then you can relay back to the team. So shifting a little bit into goals and progress reports. This is related to planning for accommodations in that I have mentioned, collecting data and making sure that you're measuring kids' progress. But, if you are a classroom teacher or a special educator, then there will be certain IEP goals that are separate from lessons and assignments that you'll be responsible for monitoring. So just going to go over a quick overview of what those goals should look like. They should be specific, observable, and measurable so that you can actually you can actually collect data and monitor kids' progress on those goals. They should be individualized to where that student is and where you want that student to go. And they are critical to IEP implementation. This is what the model IEP for Mississippi. This is what their measurable annual goal template looks like. It might look different depending on what state you're in, but it should always have that annual goal at the top. So that is where you want to be by the end of the year. And then you'll see under those short-term instructional objectives, those will be sort of broken up into 9 weeks so that you can see where you're supposed to be after the first 9 weeks, and make adjustments if you aren't actually getting to where you need to be. That needs to be a team decision as well. And I see Tahita came off so that she can help me with this scenario. We have one scenario about progress monitoring and goals.
Absolutely. You are a second grade teacher and you just got a new student in your class. You review the student's IEP that was written by her previous teacher. The student has the following overall goals. Zara will understand right and wrong. Zara will effectively complete her work. Zara will read well.
So what do y'all think about these goals? Not measurable. Morgan, great. Morgan's on fire today. But yes, that is the key, not measurable, and they are also not based on any, super vague. What is right, what is wrong. So You will need first some baseline data. Yep, Ms. Randall Blah, I agree. And yes, I will be sending out the presentation. Hopefully the chat saves and I can get all of y'all who have dropped your emails in the chat and send y'all the presentation. But yeah, we do not know where. Yeah, Miss Carter, it is like classroom rules. Yeah, and classroom rules are not goals because those are for the whole classroom and they're not individualized to the student. So IEP goals need to be individualized, measurable, and something that you can actually track. So great job, everyone. Thank you for your participation, especially this late on a Wednesday. So just going back to, let's see, going back to goals and progress reports, why it matters. Basically, it ensures that accommodations, modifications, and the interventions that are in place are actually working. So if we're collecting data, we're progress monitoring like we should, that's going to tell us a really clear, that's going to paint a really clear picture of whether that student is actually progressing toward their goals. And if they're not, then we know we need to switch something up. And if they are, then that's great. And we'll just sort of continue the course and the plan is working as it should. Helps identify gaps early and prevent students from falling through the cracks. So again, we don't want to get to that third 9 weeks and the student is failing and they have, you know, like a 25% in your class, and progress monitoring, even though it's not a grade, should sort of be tracking their progress on certain academically aligned goals. And, you know, before you get to any point, the special education teacher and the general education teacher should notice if that progress is not actually being made. And your role as a general education teacher is to be implementing those accommodations like we had talked about, collect and share data on student performance. So that could look like your observations, it could look like behavior logs, that could look like grades, work samples, anything that the student is producing or doing in your classroom is going to be really, really helpful. And collaborating with special education staff and families. So the bulk of the progress monitoring responsibility is going to be on that special education teacher or their case manager. But you know, do share some of the responsibility in terms of data collection. And then I touched on this briefly, but important to note the difference between progress monitoring and grading. Grading is, you know, what goes in the grade book, overall performance compared to the grade level standards. And progress monitoring is data collection that is tied to the actual goals in the IEP. And then monitoring can be on academic, behavioral, and functional goals. So this slide just talks about what different monitoring might look like. So if you're doing academic monitoring, writing samples, quick probes for reading fluency. So, you know, if you're requesting that a child read a passage, you know, 3 or 4 times, that could be a quick fluency probe. Behavioral monitoring, that could be some tracking, some behavior rating scales, and then other supports, digital tools, ClassForms, ClassDojo, other apps can be really helpful supports and just making that a more streamlined and easy process. And then some best practices really quickly for general educators, keep it simple, be consistent, collect data at the same time or interval, especially for those behaviors. We want to know what time those are happening. Focus on the goal, use objective data, and document accommodations. So here's just a quick slide with an example of what a goal might look like and then what your monitoring of that goal could look like. So if the reading goal is that the student's going to increase their reading fluency from 45 words per minute to 80 words per minute in 2 out of 3 trials, note that that's very measurable and specific, then your monitoring method might be just a weekly 1-minute oral reading probe. And then here's an example for behavior and organization. I'll let y'all read those quickly because I see I'm running up on time a little bit. And then just one final note on goals and progress reports. Again, with the communication and collaboration, not to beat a dead horse, but always collaborate with SPED teachers, sharing data regularly, communicating with families, providing simple reports or visuals to show progress. And then also you can share your progress monitoring with students as a way of motivating them, saying, look, you've made so much progress over the past few weeks. Keep it up. And just, having them have buy-in into the process as well can be really, really important. We have a couple more scenarios before we close out. So.
All right, this
Thank
is
you for your-
Naomi. Mr. and Mrs. Miller are concerned that their daughter, Naomi, is not making progress on her IEP goals and objectives. For the past 3 semesters, Naomi has gotten straight D's and F's on her report card. When they received the last report card, they contacted Naomi's teacher and expressed concern about her grades and asked the teacher how Naomi was doing on her IEP objectives. Naomi's teacher said she had yet to evaluate how Naomi was doing with her IEP goals, but that she would provide them with updated information at the next IEP meeting.
What do y'all think is going on in this scenario? What would you do different or the same? Now it's almost 4:30. Quick yes or no, do you think that this teacher handled it perfectly? No notes? No. Okay, thanks, Ms. Randall. What is one thing that you might do differently in this situation? I botched it. If you have a child who is not making progress in your classroom and has just gotten, semesters is not right, for the past 3 quarters, because there are only 2 semesters, if this child has gotten straight D's and F's, do you think that the teacher should have reached out beforehand? Yes. Yeah. So this just goes back to making sure that you're communicating with parents, sharing that data with all of, contact parents first semester. Great advice, Brenda. Making sure that, we're catching things early. And also, parents actually don't have to wait until the IEP meeting to get that data. You can be sharing that data with the parents as regularly as you want. And definitely when they request it, it would be great to be responsive just to make sure that that communication stays really positive and collaborative. And then we just have one last scenario.
All
This
right.
one's quick.
Thomas is a student with autism. So this is Thomas's first year in middle school, and so far things have been a disaster. Socially, Thomas is overwhelmed by the larger school setting, and academically, he's overwhelmed by all the academic subjects he's taking. Even with supports, Thomas has made no progress on his IEP goals, and he has failed all his classes except math. Thomas's mother does not feel that his IEP, which was created at the end of the last year in elementary school, is appropriate for the middle school. She contacts Thomas's teacher to see if changes can be made. The teacher advises her that Thomas's IEP is set to be reviewed in 6 months and that they will address any changes that need to be made then.
What do y'all think? Yes. Yeah. Great point, Morgan. And that is actually the trick question that this was getting at, is that parents can call an IEP meeting whenever they want. And so as a general education teacher, if you have a parent who's expressing concerns with IEP goals or anything, academic related, then you can advise them that they have the right to request an IEP meeting. And that is something where the IEP team just comes together. It doesn't have to be on that once a year schedule. It can really be whenever, and should be whenever something is coming up that is concerning and needs to be adjusted. Exactly. Exactly. Yep. Adjustments are really important, especially being proactive and catching things early on. So thank you all so much for your participation on those on those questions. I know that it's a little different in a webinar and that it's late, so I really appreciate y'all. And then this is just a final sort of reflection and action planning checklist. You know, checking in with yourself. Am I collecting data consistently? We're all humans. We're not perfect. We're not going to be collecting all the data every single day. But is it at least consistently enough to show a pattern and to understand what's going on and what's working and not working? Do I know which IEP and 504 goals I'm personally responsible for monitoring? So making sure that you're actually getting the progress data on those goals. And then thinking, how can I integrate progress monitoring into routines without it becoming extra work? Because as we know, teachers have enough on their plates. So, you know, thinking about whether there's some software that can be used to simplify the process, adjustments to lesson planning templates, collaboration, all of that good stuff. And then this, we don't really have space for discussion because it's a webinar, but here are just some sort of reflection questions to carry with you out of this presentation. Thinking about how has your understanding of IEPs and 504 plans changed as a result of this training? What strategies do you think you can use to effectively collaborate with special education staff and families? How would you approach a situation where an accommodation or modification does not seem to be helping a student succeed? Coming up with an action plan for that. How can you balance the needs of students with disabilities while also meeting the needs of the whole class? That's a really big one and something that's going to have to be, you know, it'll be different depending on the student, depending on the classroom, and that will really require a lot of collaboration with everyone on that IEP team. And what strategies can you use to effectively collaborate with special education staff and families, as we have talked about at length today. So we have about 3 minutes for question and answer. I see Tahita dropped the survey into the chat there. There's also, I will pull up the QR code if that's easier for y'all to scan. This is our first time doing this presentation, so it would be really, really helpful to know what went well and to just hear y'all's feedback. It's all anonymous and it'd just be really, really helpful to us and we would value it a lot. So I'll leave the last couple of minutes for y'all to fill out the survey, drop any questions that you might have in the Q&A box. And if there's nothing, then it was wonderful to have y'all and really appreciate your time. I'll pass it off to EAC to close out.
Oh, we do have a raised hand. If
I'm
you
so
would,
sorry.
yeah,
I
no
can't.
problem. If you would mind typing in the chat, because I don't believe that you have the capacity to come off mute. And while Lawanda, I believe, is doing that, I'm going to voice over. So if you have not already, please visit the EAC website. We have already released a plethora of information, resources, webinars, toolkits, and the like for you. But we also, in the docket, have a few other resources that are coming out. Namely, we have a chronic absenteeism toolkit that we just released last week. We have a few HR, so hiring and retention toolkits that help support schools and districts with hiring and retaining a diverse teacher workforce. And then we have some AP toolkits coming out that help support students, districts, administrators, and teachers with ensuring that there's equitable access to advanced coursework at your school. So please, if you have not done so already, register and join that newsletter, and then stay abreast by, visiting our website frequently. You'll have access to this webinar as well as our additional outputs that will be coming out. And also, you all, having been equipped with this knowledge and information, are now leaders in your context, right? So now you have the capacity to serve as an advocate for your students, helping them know their rights, helping parents know their rights and community members know their rights, and feel empowered to turnkey this information, maybe even lead a training at your site and see how you can really get involved and sort of push this mission to advance equitable opportunities to education for all students forward. And lastly, the EX South serves Region 2, which includes Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, the beloved Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. So if you have friends, colleagues, in this area who are looking for some in-depth work at their sites or within their districts, please point them in our direction. We are happy to assist them, and we are lucky to be granted the opportunity to assist them free of charge. So please send them our way. Lily, as always, you did an amazing job, and I'm so grateful that we were able to partner with the experts at Mississippi Center for Justice to provide this critical webinar and turnkey this really important information. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. And quick shout out to Sunflower County Consolidated School District. I see Mr. Murphy and Dr. Proctor Davis are in the chat. So thank you all for your support and passing the information along to your staff. We look forward to continuing to work with y'all.
You'll have a great evening.